In the years following 1883, which saw the death of Turgenev, the so-called golden era, or Zolotaya Epocha, of Russian literature came to an end. Starting with Pushkin near the beginning of the 19th century, it continued to about the middle of the 1880s. Near the end of that decade, some new tendencies took hold among both Russian critics and writers, and there arose a kind of divide between those who remained attached to the earlier way of writing, often called realism, although to tell you the truth, that's probably an oversimplified description of a rich and varied corpus of works, and those who sought new ways of understanding experience and its representation in literature. The latter often called themselves decadents or decadenti. By the way, they called themselves that, and they were proud of the name on the assumption that the brightest colors in the seasons always came in the fall, when the trees were about to die. So the decadence, or decadenti, or décadence, reflected the most beautiful things in life. They also called themselves symbolists, meaning they didn't present directly what they were talking about, that is the direct truth, but rather they presented symbols that represented the truth that somehow lay behind those symbols. It fit very nicely, of course, the Freudian system of psychology when the subconscious underlay the conscious. By this, then, they wanted to indicate that they were shoving aside the old polemics around large, one might say huge, civic and philosophical themes. Instead, they wanted to explore a world that lay hidden somewhere beneath or beyond ordinary consciousness. Now, we don't have a lot of time in these lectures to deal with these so-called symbolists and decadents. The period itself was often called the Silver Age, in contrast to the term Golden Age. They include not only some very interesting poets, but also musicians, artists of the dance, painters, sculptors. Almost every form of the arts was represented in the so-called Silver Age. They produced things that had tremendous effect in Europe, and also went along with things that were happening in places like Paris, Rome, and even New York. The symbolists had a tremendous impact on the literary imagination. Sometimes this happened just because people were so terribly upset. Think for just a moment about the early reactions to modern music of people like Stravinsky and Prokofiev, and to a certain extent Shostakovich, not to mention Bartók and Hindemith. People simply didn't understand. They thought it was some kind of cacophony or something that couldn't be comprehended. Actually, if they took the trouble to listen to it carefully and understand what the artists were getting at, you could make a great deal of sense out of it, but the sense lay behind the surface in a way that earlier classical music simply did not. The same was true of poetry and literature. If you read the works of people and poets like Bloch and Brusov and other writers at that time, what you'll find is a very different kind of writing that at first glance can seem absolutely nonsensical and totally incomprehensible. But if you get into it, if you begin to understand it and what they were trying to do, you see they were getting at a very vigorous form of art, quite different from anything we'd known before. Now, Anton Chekhov occupied a literary position really not very far from the traditionalists, yet his prose and drama opened the way to very new ways of thinking about the theater and, in addition to that, the art of the short story. In just a few moments, when we take a look at particularly at his play The Seagull, we'll see how he dealt with that kind of thing. Chekhov was born into a family that had known slavery intimately. His grandfather had been a serf. The writer openly stated that in his lifetime he had to squeeze the slavery out of his blood slowly, deliberately, drop by drop. If this was the case in the life of a man who was as strong and well put together as Chekhov, imagine what it was for others to overcome the terrible legacy that was left by many centuries of years of slavery. Chekhov reflects this very clearly, and yet, at the same time, he also reflects a kind of strength that was in the people that enabled him to overcome what he was talking about, as he put it, drop by drop of blood. He was educated as a doctor, and he practiced medicine for a good part of his life. In his approach to his characters, it's not hard to see the detached and observant eyes of the medical examiner. In an early part of his life, while still in medical school, he was saddled with the responsibility of supporting his brothers and sisters. He wrote light, humorous stories under the pseudonym of Chechonte. He did this mainly to get money for the support of his very needy brothers and sisters, but at the same time began to develop a certain style. In the beginning, you might call it almost a form of, humor you'd find on the vaudeville stage. As he went on and began to get experiences and think ever more deeply about what he was writing, the writing became deeper and deeper. He eventually grew to be the Chekhov that we know, the man of international fame. When he'd achieved certain popularity among the reading public, he started to write stories of greater substance and develop into the Chekhov we now know not only today but throughout the world. As I say, that's the Chekhov that we know. However, in the West, especially in England and the United States, that is the English-speaking world, his greatest reputation is that of a playwright. I don't think it would be an exaggeration to call him an icon, if not the god, of the modern international theater. It's almost impossible to imagine contemporary theater that doesn't deal with Chekhov in some way or another. Of course, this is well borne out. If you go to the drama schools of America today, they're just loaded with the thought and experimentation and acting and all those things that you find in the presentations by Chekhov's plays, which are very subtle and not so easy to do. It takes a very subtle understanding to catch the characters that Chekhov tried to present them. As early as the 1880s, Chekhov had tried his hand at writing plays, but they didn't become widely known at that particular time. However, in 1895, he set to work on what's called in Russian Chaika, or the Seagull, which was fated to become one of the best-known plays of its time and a formative drama of 20th century theater. I don't think it's an exaggeration to call it that. I would even be willing to predict it will be a formative drama in 21st century theater as well. However, his first performance in a traditional Petersburg theater in late 1895 was a total flop. Chekhov was mercilessly raked over the coals by the well-known critics of the day, and the sensitive man swore he would never write for the theater again. Obviously, the Petersburg theater didn't understand what Chekhov was trying to do, because what he was trying to do was so tremendously different from anything they had done before. They simply didn't understand it, or as we say, and here I like to use a slang word, they didn't dig it, a good word to use in the theater among actors. The result was a mess, which the critics lambasted, I suppose it would be fair to say, with fire and sword. Then something very important happened in the history of the theaters we know. Chekhov was visited by a man named Nemirovich Danchenko, one of the founders of a new theater in Moscow, which took on the name of the Moscow Art Theater, in Russian Makhat, a new institution at that time. Danchenko was more or less responsible for the literary side, and the director, whose pseudonym, now internationally famous, was sort of godlike among actors, was Stanislavski. The rest is well-known theatrical history. That theater became one of the central theaters of European culture. Danchenko eventually persuaded Chekhov to let the young group perform The Seagull. It took him a year to persuade Chekhov to let him have it, and the new presentation captured the rapturous attention of the theater public, that is, first in Russia, then throughout the world. Today, the curtain of the Moscow Art Theater is decorated with one symbol that everybody recognizes, a seagull. It's worth taking some time, I think, to talk a little bit about the Moscow Art Theater, which was centrally connected with Chekhov in those days. For anybody who cares something about theater, and I'm certainly one of those people, it'd be absolutely impossible to understand what's going on in contemporary theater without understanding what Stanislavski did. What he did was to construct a kind of realism. That is, it was his idea that the actor on stage should not just represent the idea or the character or the emotion the player was trying to get across. The actor had to be, in a genuinely verisimilitudinous way, that character, that feeling. The actor himself or herself must go through that actual emotion. The actor must look back into his or her life to find some incident, some time, some place, or a similar emotion that was experienced or expressed. The actor must go back by a series of exercises and emotional, you might almost say psychological tricks, so the actor genuinely gets himself or herself into that particular emotion. Then and only then is genuine emotion taking place. And Stanislavski was ready to work on a play that took just as long as it took to achieve that particular kind of emotion, or one is tempted to call it realism. It's a kind of emotional power or emotional connection that is perhaps the best way to put it. As a matter of fact, Stanislavski wrote several famous books. One, My Life in Art, the other, An Actor Prepares, where he talks about these matters in great detail, with great subtlety and great understanding. It's clear that Stanislavski had in mind a very creative, and of course in his day a very revolutionary, idea about theater. The great actors and actresses of the 19th century, in particular I'm thinking of Douze, the famous French actress, acted by a system called gestes plastiques, that is to say, plastic gestures. There were certain gestures which were appropriate to certain emotions. When you expressed that emotion as an actor or an actress, you had to do that gesture just as gracefully, beautifully, and well thought out as you possibly could. Every part was intellectually thought out and plotted so the actor would go through certain emotions that everyone would recognize and connect it with a convention. Stanislavski, of course, wanted to break these conventions. He wanted to break that idea of just taking set gestures and rather getting to the actual emotion, which might require any gesture, any action on the part of the actor or actress. The results were very impressive. It soon became clear, not only in Russia, but in England and the United States, that what he was doing was producing extraordinary effects and expressions in the theater. If you think of the most important and creative forces about the theater in this country, one is tempted to think back to a group of actors eventually called the Actors Studio in New York back in the 1940s. Later on, it came to be run by a young Greek man who had come from Turkey, a man named Elia Kazan, who, as a matter of fact, studied with Stanislavski. He went to Moscow after Stanislavski came to New York. In connection with this theater, and of course with the actions with the director's action of Kazan, you'll think of such people as Marlon Brando, Marilyn Monroe, the playwright Arthur Miller, and Eli Wallach. As a matter of fact, if you think of Russian, even Mikhails, the famous actor in the Jewish theater, he and all of these people were certain products of the ideas of Stanislavski in the theater. In short, some of our very best theater in this country, that is in the USA, is a result of what was done in the theater that Chekhov's plays made so famous. Now, The Seagull is a play that plays a very important role in all of what I just talked about. There's not a single name I just mentioned in the long list of names in the theater that hasn't in some way or another dealt very intimately with this play. It's literally a kind of formation of contemporary theater, and I suspect it's going to be that for a long time to come. The plot of the play is intensely connected with the theater, as well as the nature of the literary artist. One of its central characters is a young man named Konstantin Treplyov. By the way, the name implies a kind of fluttering or shaking. He's a young, ambitious playwright who's about to have the pleasure of experiencing the first performance of his work, a play written very much in the spirit of the new young writers at that time who wanted a radical change in literary art, in tune with the ideology of the symbolists and decadents I've just been talking about a few moments ago. Treplyov is on fire with his new ideas. Furthermore, he's the son of a very famous actress, Arkadyina, who has achieved great fame in the classical theater of Russia, which is totally opposed to everything her son is doing. He is going to prove himself and to his mother in this sort of chamber theater that takes place on her estate. The play is going to crack the mold of modern theater. It's going to be a tremendous revolution in the life of theater. His fire extends, by the way, not only to the art, but also to the young actress named Nina Zarychnaya, her name means beyond or across the river, the young woman who'll be performing his monodrama. Treplyov is passionately in love with her. As a matter of fact, she's probably less in love with him than she is with theater, but nevertheless, at the beginning of the play, she seems to go along with his love. She can't quite understand all the lines or the effects he's put in the theater. They seem completely not understandable, given the traditional nature of the theater. But he says, look, it's all right. Go ahead. Everything will be all right. So she agrees to go through with it. The people attending the play, many of them relatives of Treplyov, including his mother, sit down, and they can't quite understand. That's an understatement. They can't understand at all what is coming off. He raises the curtain. And it begins with a speech that nobody can understand. Of course, Nina is pronouncing the speech. As a matter of fact, there's some strange sort of an effect with red sulfur burning, and they smell the sulfur. The speech is so strange, and the effects are so out of this world that nobody can understand what he's talking about, and they begin to make fun of him. They say, well, you talk about the devil. Obviously, the devil's in the form of the sulfur we smell. You talk about ages and ages ago when people spoke a different language. How can we know anything about that? Triplios, amour propre, his self-love, is touched to the quick. He can't stand it anymore. Furiously, he rushes to the stage and yells, strike the curtain, strike the curtain. I see to it you people are new people are not allowed to be in the theater. The only people allowed to be in the theater are those who slavishly follow the desires of old hacks, like my mother. He rushes off in a fury. Of course, the mother is somewhat abashed that she's caused this kind of reaction in her son. But at the same time, she feels totally justified in her reaction. She says, nobody could understand what he was trying to do there. Dr. Dorn, a medical man who's visiting the mother's estate, has a somewhat different reaction, with some sympathy for both Tripliov and his mother. After he sees the performance and Tripliov's stormy outburst, he says, there is something in this play. Of course, it's crude and not yet well worked out, but there's something in this play that has power. You understand that what I've just described is a play that exists within Chekhov's play, The Seagull. The opening of The Seagull, right before we get into the play within the play, that is a presentation of Tripliov's work that I've just described, contains very typically Chekhovian language. It's a dialogue between a poor school teacher and the daughter of an estate manager. She's dressed in black to indicate mourning for her life, and he claims not to be mourning his fate, which seems bitter enough, 23 rubles a month to support a large family, and a desperate love for her that she nevertheless rejects. The high-flown artistic aspirations of Tripliov and the mundane concerns of these two seem widely disconnected, yet the art of Chekhov brings them together in a very special way. Of course, Tripliov's high hopes and ambitions are far removed from the mundane desires of the underpaid teacher and the estate manager's daughters. Yet the frustrations which they'll meet, Tripliov's play will be a miserable flop. Nina, the young actress, will seek union with another writer. The poor schoolteacher will fall into a loveless marriage with a woman who continues to mourn for her life and nurse a secret love for Dr. Dorn. They'll put them all in the same Chekhovian universe of people who often walk past each other and must live their lives with great pain and minimum gratification. There's something about an absence of communication in Chekhov's plays that remind us very much of certain aspects of everyday life. It's sometimes very hard for us to get across our feelings, our ideas, our experiences to other people, because after all, other people's feelings, ideas, and experiences are very different from ours. In the effort to make ourselves mutually understood, often we meet great obstacles which are movingly and beautifully presented by Chekhov in his play. Chekhov calls his play a comedy. Given the high level of frustration and pain I've just described and experienced by the characters, it's often hard for the readers to understand why. Certainly Stanislavski, the famous director, did not stage the play in a comic way. We have many statements from Chekhov himself complaining that Stanislavski completely misunderstood the author's intent. I suspect that Chekhov's notion of the comic is connected with his view as a medical observer who has to remain at some emotional distance in order to understand the ailments of his patients. When one looks at human beings from this vantage point, they can seem comic and more than a little bit absurd, as if we're viewing from Olympus and saying in Shakespeare's words, "Oh, what fools these mortals be." This is very close to the view of Dr. Dorn, the character who nevertheless saw something very powerful in Tripliov's play. We see the theater from a very different point of view when we see the older generation in The Seagull. Madame Arkadyevna, an actress with a wide reputation as the mother of Tripliov, her affections are bound up with another writer, Trigorin, who expresses a wonderful feeling about writing. He says, "I write, and I write, and I write. Wherever I go, I see material for writing that I can't keep myself from writing about. And what's the upshot?" They say, "Well, Trigorin, a dear writer, a fine writer, but not Turgenev." This is doubly ironic when you stop to think of today when people often say, "Turgenev, a dear writer, a fine writer, but not Tolstoy or Dostoevsky." It's odd how these things turn in the history of literature. Arkadyevna's reactions remain constant throughout this part of the play. She sees no sense in what her son's been doing. She refuses to give him any kind of encouragement, in spite of the fact there are intervals in the play where she does show him some love, but they don't last long. Her emotions are all wrapped up in Prigorine. He's not going to give her son anything that he needs or requires from her. To make matters even worse, Nina, the young actress, has thrown herself at the feet of Prigorine. She tells him to use her in any way he likes, and boy, does he ever take advantage of this. He uses her and then spits her out like a used-up orange. When Treplyov hears about this, he's quite upset, and he begins to think about his own writing and realizes that he made a mistake in the way he's thought about it. It's not so much a matter of forms. It's not whether you're a revolutionary in the theater or going through the old traditions, whether you're a symbolist or not. The important thing is to express emotion as it is genuinely and truly felt. And it's clear this is close to the way that Chekhov feels. While Treplyov has realized this, Nina comes back, and this time she visits him. As she visits him, she's in a state very close to that of insanity after what she's gone through. She compares herself, she says, to that magnificent seagull which you once shot and put at my feet. Now I am that seagull. The seagull has obviously become the symbol of destroyed lives. The way a hunter destroys the life of an animal, the hunter seeks to shoot. Nina clearly feels her life parallels the situation of the beautiful bird that was slain. She no longer has any warm feelings for Treplyov. She runs out, and both he and we realize she'll never come back. At that point, the scene shifts to the room next door where people are playing cards. As they're playing, they suddenly hear a pop or an explosion. Dr. Dorn goes into the next room to examine it and comes back and says, "Oh, don't worry, it's all right, it's nothing. Nothing but the explosion in one of my bottles of medicine." Then he says to the other characters, "Look, get Arkadina out of the way so she can't hear. Treplyov has just committed suicide. He shot himself." Just as Treplyov killed that seagull for the good of Nina, he kills himself because he feels he can no longer make a contribution to art. How one can interpret this as a comedy, I must admit that I'm not quite sure myself. But it's a very moving play, and a play that goes into so many different aspects of human psychology and experience is very difficult for actors to do well. But once done well, it's an extraordinarily moving play. Now Chekhov, although he's very popular in this part of the world as a playwright, was not only a playwright, he was also the writer of a series of prose stories, some of which are very moving. Furthermore, his stories don't seem to exhibit what we normally tend to think of as characteristic of Russian stories. They're short. They're brief. They make their point in a very short amount of time. We're not talking about long novels that go on for hundreds of pages. Some stories are only 3 or 4 pages, but what Chekhov manages to get across is something very powerful. A good example of Chekhov's art in this way, although a slightly longer story, is a story whose title is usually translated as The Darling. In Russian, the title is Dushechka, which literally means little soul. This is a good example of Russian diminutives. The word for soul is dusha. This is Dushechka, dear little soul, is often used as a term of endearment, like darling or sweetheart in English. Readers have taken it to refer to the famous Greek legend around Psyche, whose name is the Greek word for soul. This tale has often been interpreted, that is Chekhov's tale, has often been interpreted as a representation of the dangers in combining the force of eros with the force of the soul. In Chekhov's tale, a lady named Olga is first presented as the wife of a theater manager who is eternally nervous about getting sufficient audiences to support his enterprise. He's always yelling, "Strashny ubытki, horrible losses, horrible financial losses." Her every thought is devoted to the theater, and her kindness and sweetness causes everyone to call her Dushechka. The theater manager is terribly upset. People won't come to his play. He did Faust Inside Out, whatever that means, by the way. But no matter what he does, people won't come. He's experiencing strashny ubытki, terrible losses. Alas, he dies. Of course, when he dies, Olga is no longer attached to the theater, and nobody calls her Dushechka anymore. But soon enough, she's courted by a lumber merchant who then marries her. And now she says, "So what's so good about that theater anyway? It's just a bunch of senseless vaudeville. The only important things in the world are the details connected with the manufacture and sale of lumber." She knows how to say plywood and oakwood and all the technical things that go together with lumber. And she can't imagine a time when she was connected with that superficial thing called theater. And everyone calls her Dushechka. They come to her place to have baranki. I like to say the Russian form of bagels, but my Russian friends say they're not. And bublichki, and all the wonderful things that are connected with a boiling samovar and a good hot cup of tea. Well, alas, The lumber merchant also dies. And again, nobody calls her Dushechka. There's a wonderful little intermezzo in the story where she sits, and because she's not connected with anybody, she has no opinions whatsoever. And what a terrible thing it is not to have any opinions at all about anything in this world. And the reader is almost lulled, perhaps to sleep by this. But now, lo and behold, a veterinarian comes to her. Soon she takes up with the veterinarian, and soon she's talking about diseases of animals and their problems and what she'd have to do to keep the cattle and pets alive and how very good veterinarians are for the animal world and the human world. And again, everybody calls her Dushechka. The veterinarian is no fool. He knows that the two previous men that have been connected to this woman have died. There's something about her that seems to bring on death. So he leaves, and she loses all interest in life. No opinion whatsoever. And one can again understand how painful it is, and no one calls her Dushechka. But happily, the veterinarian returns, this time with his wife and child. He had taken up with her before, but obviously not married her. She rejoices, puts him up in a wing of her house, and takes over the care of the child with all its attendant worries and problems. And once more, people call her Dushechka. At the end of the story, the child goes off to school. She follows me and says, "Look, Auntie, don't follow me. I want to go on my own." He comes home, and the two of them worry over his homework. Oh, my God, what is an island? An island is a body of land completely surrounded by water. How difficult it is to learn. How hard they are on the young people. Oh, these poor young people, she says, they have such hard things to learn. She reverberates to every feeling of the young child. As a matter of fact, at the end of the story, he's a real kid. We hear the stirring. He says, "Get out of my way." He's stirring in his sleep. He's dreaming. "Get out of my way. I'm going to give it to you. I'm going to get into a fight. Watch out, watch out." She sits there just praying and exulting in the fact she's once more connected with a human being. By the way, Tolstoy did not like Chekhov's plays very much. And he would tell him, you talk to Chekhov, whose name and patronymic was Anton Pavlovich. He said, Anton Pavlovich, I love you very much. You're a wonderful man, and I love your stories. But your plays, they're impossibly bad. They're worse than Shakespeare's. Tolstoy couldn't stand Shakespeare. Maybe it was out of professional jealousy, but then again, maybe he felt there was too much violence. In any case, this same Tolstoy interpreted the story I've just told you about as a retelling of the biblical tale of Balaam, the priest of a people who stood in the way of the people of Israel on its journey out of Egypt toward the Promised Land. These people, that is, who were meeting the people of Israel, were getting rather nervous about meeting them because rumors have been going around that they've been conquering people here, they've been conquering people there. The people of Israel seem to have some extraordinary force on their side. Of course, the Israelites claimed it was God. So in order to neutralize this force, Balaam, the prophet of the people, was ordered to go out and pronounce a curse on the people of Israel. He went out on his donkey. As a matter of fact, the donkey had sense enough to try and stop him, but he beat the donkey, so the donkey, in order to avoid the beating, went ahead. Balaam came out to proclaim a curse. He opened his mouth, and instead of a curse, out came a blessing. What the devil's going on? I meant to curse, and a blessing came out of my mouth? He went back. He reinforced himself. Again, he went out of the donkey. Again, the donkey didn't want to go out. And again, he beat the donkey. And again, he tried to pronounce a curse, and out came a blessing. He did it a third time, and again, he tried to curse, and out came a blessing. Finally, he understood, and this is biblical language, it was impossible to curse those whom the Lord God had blessed. Tolstoy said that Chekhov in the story was like Balaam. He had intended to make Olga Dushechka, a comic character with her light-minded adoption of different professions. But the result was only a demonstration of the power of love. She became Dushechka, that is, a living soul, only when she was deeply in love with another person. And the power of that all-giving love was the highest mark of humanity. In short, as Tolstoy points out, and of course as the Bible implies, true love is blind. It gives itself to those whose feelings arouse our feelings and to whose love we respond with our love.